And so when when in the first book, when I chose these subjects, pathology, genetics, the Chinese police, and knew nothing about them, it was an enormous challenge to then go out and do the research. And I did. And you know, at the time of writing was certainly really well boned up in all these subjects. I got a professor of genetics in Canada to advise me. I got an American pathologist who then went on to advise me on all the other subsequent books. He's now in San Diego, medical examiner in San Diego. But the Chinese police was the toughest one of the lot.
Right.
Because at the time I started researching, there was nothing on the internet, nothing about them. There were no books. And I thought, how do I get inside the Chinese police? This is a really tough one. And I searched about on the internet, and I eventually came across a guy called Dr. Richard Ward, who's an American criminologist who was with the University of Illinois in Chicago at the time. It turned out that he had spent most of the 90s in Shanghai training virtually the top 500 cops in China in the latest Western policing techniques.
Oh, their own version of ANARD, huh?
Yes. And he was a god among the Chinese police. And so I wrote to him and explained that I was writing this book and would he help? And he said, well, yeah, but I think we should meet. He said, I'm coming to Paris to give a talk at an international conference on terrorism. Why don't we meet for dinner? So I went up to Paris, and my wife and I had dinner with him and his wife, and we got on really well. And I think during that meal I passed some kind of invisible litmus test, and because the next thing I knew there were faxes and emails and telephone calls going backwards and forwards to China. So when I went out to research that first book, I was greeted with open arms and doors just opened for me. We were met at the airport, we were taken to the University of Public Security, which is the police university in Beijing, got access to police headquarters, forensics. I was taken under the wing of a cop who was, well, he was effectively the best-known cop in China because of a very high-profile case that he'd solved involving 4 criminals who'd been smuggling precious artifacts out of the country. Wu Herping was his name, and he got, as a result of cracking this case, he got promotion to the head of the propaganda department in the Ministry of Public Security, which is the police ministry. And propaganda there means something different, and what they actually did there was make TV cop shows, you know, like CSI Beijing. It would be that kind of thing. But the first thing he did was he did an adaptation of, or a kind of, it wasn't documentary, it was a kind of dramatization of this investigation that had got him the promotion. Did 8 one-hour episodes that he wrote himself, produced himself, and starred in as himself. Hence, he
just like Clint Eastwood.
Absolutely. But that's why he became the best-known cop in China, because, you know, your average nightly TV audience in China is between 500 and 600 million.
Right. Well, that leads me to ask, are your books translated into Chinese? Is this series?
The first one has been translated and
didn't you tell me there's a co-venture between a French and a Chinese film company looking at filming The Firemaker? Yeah, in English with what, Chinese subtitles?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the stuff that's going on exclusively between the Chinese would be in Chinese with English subtitles, but all the dialogue between Margaret and the Beijing cop Li would be in English.
Sure. And well, I mean, France has a long and, you know, distinguished and then, you know, really bloody in the 50s history, you know, with the Far East anyway, Indochina, because they had some colonial stuff there, and, you know.
There's a lot of cultural exchange.
There is.
The Chinese directors come and show films every year at Cannes. And in fact, they're looking at the moment at 3 of those directors who won the prize at Cannes in recent years as possible directors for the movie of The Firemaker.
Well, I think it would be really exciting to be able to do that. Now, they meet and we're doing something with genetically altered rice and stuff happens, but then they obviously aren't fused together. So how do you bring them back together to work The Case and the Forced Sacrifice?
Well, it was an interesting one. She has not had a good time in China. She wants to get back to the States. But she's had to provide evidence and give testimony to the Chinese authorities. And she's just finished doing all that and is about to head back to the States when she gets called in by the ambassador, who tells her that he'd like her to stay on for a while to do an autopsy on a murder victim. And this is an American citizen of Chinese origin who has become the fourth victim in a serial crime spree in which victims have been beheaded. And because this fourth one is an American citizen, the Americans persuaded the Chinese that, not just an American citizen who was working for the American embassy. So they have a real vested interest in finding out what happened to this guy, and they want an American pathologist to carry out the autopsy, at least jointly with the Chinese. So that's how she gets enmeshed again in China and the Chinese investigation.
She's a pretty prickly character.
She is.
She's sort of Scottish in that sense. I mean, you Scots are, can really like butt heads and be,
well,
contrary.
When the Firemaker first came out in the UK, I did an interview with the Edinburgh Evening News newspaper, and the reporter asked me who the character of Margaret Campbell was based on, and I said glibly, thinking, it was just one of those things you say off the top of your head. I said, well, actually, she's based on my wife, who has a bit of an acerbic tongue on her, and of course, a few days later when the paper came out, and actually I was driving the car and my wife opened up the paper to look at the piece, there was this big bold subhead which said, the pathologist is based on my wife who has an acerbic tongue on her. The first I knew about it was this shriek in the passenger seat beside me, and I got the full force of that acerbic tongue.
I bet you did. But I mean, Margaret Campbell, what could be more of a Scottish name than Margaret Campbell?
That's
so
right.
You imply, that she is a Scottish ancestry. Even though she's there from Chicago, which is not actually known as an enclave of Scots, but rather, Poles and other things. I'm from Chicago, so I know that. But I think it works really well. I mean, crime novels are built out of conflict and, relationships that may fracture or may never coalesce and all the rest. Lisa C. did 3 of my very favorite books, The Flower Net, and I don't remember the name of the second one, and then Dragon Bones was the third. And she had a female Beijing police detective and an American lawyer. But again, the reason the American lawyer would get involved with her is the death of an American citizen.
Right.
There's one found floating in a lake, I think up near the Summer Palace, that beautiful lake outside Beijing. And that allows you to have a foothold, it allows you to have someone looking at another culture that isn't inside it, and so you don't get into all those awful questions that plague crime writers about how authentic.
Exactly.
There's a lot of criticism for, Brits writing American novels or Americans writing British novels because there's all this stuff you just get wrong in the psychology or nuance of language, whatever. So I did think that you had a great idea. How come at the end of 6 you stopped? Was it a lack of?
It was just time for a change.
You yourself were ready to do something like Extraordinary People.
Yeah. I mean, I was a screenwriter working in television for 20 years before I focused on just writing the books, and it was mostly serial drama that I wrote, and I worked for several shows which were top-rated shows in the UK. And the money was great. I mean, I was earning really good money and enjoying the work, but you get to a point where you feel you've maybe got as much out of these people as you're going to be able to, and maybe you want to pass the baton on to somebody else. And so each time I would arrive at a point and say, no, it's time to finish. It's time to move on to something else. And it was exactly the same thing with the books.
Well, it's also true that you build up a lot of baggage for characters as you move through a series. So there comes a point where finding a story that's going to work for Lee and for Margaret is going to be more work. Or you may get a story idea that, like the one you had for Extraordinary People, that just isn't going to fit them.
Yeah.
But, you haven't ruled out the possibility, especially if, for example, the movie took off and there was interest, and I'll maybe writing another one.